Dr. Maxwell, welcome to the podcast. We're so grateful to have your voice in this conversation. To begin, could you tell us a little bit about your journey, what has led you to work with kids and teens in the field of psychiatry?
Yeah, I went to medical school and I thought I would become a surgeon. And I quickly realized I just had a passion for understanding sort of all the things that go into well-being. And psychiatry felt like a great way to achieve that. So, yeah, happy to be here and chat with you about the journey.
Thank you. We are totally aware that you've worked both locally and globally in a wide variety of mental health settings. What have those diverse experiences taught you, and what do kids need most to be able to thrive?
Yeah, one of the things I think anybody notices when they travel is different cultures and different communities have different ways of living. And one of the things that seems to really help kids thrive is community, social connection, that social fabric that kids feel loved and part of something. And so it's just, I traveled and did a lot of medical outreach things early in my career, or even during my training. And I think a lot of those early experiences have shaped my understanding of the human condition and what it means to be well.
I also believe that you are linked to the YMCA of San Diego here. What is your relationship with the Y in San Diego?
Yeah, so I've been on the board of directors for the past maybe year and a half. It's something that is really fills me with a lot of joy to be part of an organization that, as a kid, I grew up going to a Y, and I grew up benefiting from the programs at my local Y. And so to be a part of that side of well-being and community, it's really been a joy to be a part of that.
Thank you for your continued efforts. So just circling back, it's really interesting that you spoke about the connection and that relationship being no matter where you were, it's the thing, the factor that most supports children and young people to thrive. We are aware there is a mental health crisis currently. We see the news, we read the reports, we see it coming through our doors in some of the youth and family services. From your perspective as a clinician and an educator, can you describe what's actually happening out there, what you're seeing on a day-to-day basis?
It's a great question, and we certainly do see it in the media a lot. I mean, we're really bombarded by this idea that there's a youth mental health crisis. But to put it into perspective, at Rady Children's Hospital, when I started there about 10, 12 years ago, we were seeing, maybe one or two kids a day with psychiatric crisis. The first year I was there, I was 168 through the entire first year I was there. That's in our emergency department, coming in with dangerousness of some sort, of some real intense crisis that a child is having. Now, if you fast forward to where we are today, we see a little over 4,500, somewhere around 4,700 last fiscal year. So in a little over a decade, the number of kids coming to our emergency department in psychiatric crisis has gone up by about 2,800%, 28 times more. Now, schools are seeing that, companies are seeing that, the YMCA is seeing that, pediatric clinics are seeing that. It's really happening throughout our communities and throughout the infrastructure that tries to support kids and families. And so we're really looking at it's probably never been as bad as it is right now for youth mental health. And at the same time, I think people are starting to wake up to it because we're being bombarded with these ideas. And I think there are now reasons for optimism that we can turn the tide on this crisis that we've seen for the past several years.
Wow, that is some pretty stark figures. It is pretty alarming. What are the symptoms and trends that your colleagues are seeing more frequently that are coming across in teens and young people? What presents most?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest increase that we've seen is anxiety and depression. So kids are more and more socially isolated. Probably people have seen that in the news, that less and less kids can say that they have a close friend that they could rely on. Families actually is something that isn't always talked about in the news, but families are more disintegrated than they have been in past generations. Kids are a lot of times finding themselves feeling like they're alone. And so I think that's something we see very, very commonly is isolation, social isolation, and sometimes the anxiety and depression that comes from feeling like you're alone as a young child. And so I think there's ways that we can change that, ways that we can change that with the way we interact with technology, the way schools are set up, the way social programs and things that are done in the YMCA work? And also, how can we provide better health care to try to identify things early and point parents and kids in the right direction?
There's definitely a lot more awareness for parents and even for teenagers themselves around like what mental health is. And I think the stigma is definitely broken down a little bit. But do you think because we have a lot more awareness and people are attuned to what those signs and symptoms are that you're seeing an increase in children coming through?
Yeah, I think there's a multifactorial reason. It's a great question. Decreasing the stigma of mental health conditions is a really, really good thing. When people need support, they should have support available to them, and we should celebrate that. Some of the things that we see, unfortunately, there are segments of the teen population, especially like young boys, that are less likely to present for care when they need it. They're less likely to talk about their emotions than girls may be. And so I think there's a multifactorial reason for the increase that we've seen. One is decreased stigma. One is we see things in the media all the time about it, and sometimes perception can become reality. Another is, real things are changing in our society. And things have, for some kids and families, gotten to the point where it's almost like the straw that breaks the camel's back, and it just becomes a little bit insurmountable. I think there's a lot of different factors to it, and it's one of the things that makes this topic so difficult, is it's so multifactorial and can't really give a black and white answer to the things that ail some of us.
It's interesting that you bring up that males, young teenage boys, are having less chance of going to speak to a therapist or present for
Mm.
treatment. Is there any additional supports or advice, or is there anything that we can do as practitioners that could support that, or even as parents that could support and change that trend?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's partially being aware of it. I think that can really help people understand that, hey, potentially, even if a teenage boy is seeming like everything's going okay, looking out for things that might change. So, are there changes in their behavior patterns? Are they not wanting to hang out with friends that they used to hang out with? Do they not want to play sports that they used to want to play? Have they withdrawn from school activities? Are their academics falling? So I think there's things that if we're aware that they might not verbally come up to us and tell us what's happening in their lives emotionally, we can look for patterns of behavior that might be an indicator or evidence that something might be happening. And a lot of times, if you have trusted relationships, so always ensuring that you have a trusted relationship with your kids, or if you're a practitioner with your patients or clients, I think those are the ways that you can give an opening for boys or young kids in general to tell you about what's going on in their lives.
There is a lot of people out there that will have this attitude. Kids are just kids. Every generation has a crisis and goes through some sort of challenge, and kids, everybody turns out okay. And we're kind of making a big deal out of this. This is kind of a perception that's out there. Are we making a big deal out of nothing? Or like you've already given us the statistics, but like, what is the reality of this? And what is different about this? Or what would you say to someone that would say, well, kids are kids. We've all had our challenges. I turned out okay. What would your response be to that?
Yeah, it's something that I come across a lot actually. People might say, well, it wasn't like this when I was a kid. People didn't think about this. And I would say they're right. It wasn't like this when they were a kid. They didn't have to deal with cyberbullying. They didn't have to deal with constant bombardment of different sort of electronic notifications and screen time. They didn't have to deal with potentially the social fabric of society fraying at the edges, which it has over the past several decades. There's a lot of things that kids are dealing with now that they weren't dealing with 10, 20, 30 years ago. Most of the data that's been tracked over the years says that youth mental health is probably at its peak between around 1990 to 2005 or so. And so we've been tracking these things for a number of years, and all of them seem to be going in a negative direction. So I mentioned family disconnection, a number of friends or number of kids with anxiety or depressive symptoms. Suicide rate has also gone up over the decades. That's a black and white figure that is tragic and something that can't be discounted, that more kids are ending their lives because of psychiatric illness. Parents are also less optimistic about their kids' future. So parents are also pessimistic that their kids might enjoy a life similar to theirs or better than theirs in the future. So you can look at Gallup polls does these things, or the CDC has metrics. There's lots of other researchers that have been looking at this over a number of years. And when multiple data points keep telling the same story, I think that's an indication that this isn't just us making some big deal out of it or trying to grab headlines. There's really something happening with kids that we all need to be aware of, because ultimately, our kids and their minds are the most precious resource we have for our futures.
Absolutely. And that's really why we want to have these conversations and make sure we're generating awareness. You touched on it a little bit there, but like, and at the start, there's some kids that are either scheduled out, they are in like multiple curriculum, school-based, extracurricular classes, sports, church, additional, like they're just scheduled out. And then there's some kids that are totally isolated. They are just about maybe making school, going home, either gaming or working through technology, social media, but really have minimum connections. What are the major combination of things that are actually putting pressure on these kids? Are they facing burnout? Are we putting too much pressure on our kids? Or where do we find a balance? Or what's your experience of this?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, hit the nail on the head with the idea of how do we find balance. And it's a difficult question because for each child, balance might look a little bit different. And so there can't be a one size fits all approach to this. Some kids develop faster or slower. Some kids are academically more or less gifted. Some kids are more interested in alone time. Some kids are artists. Some kids, families have parents that have two jobs, and maybe having family dinner time is difficult. I think that the key would be finding what the right thing in each child's situation is, where we're balancing out teaching kids resilience through having them do hard things and fail every once in a while, and allowing them to learn how to fail and get up again. It's a cliche, but I think it's a worthwhile cliche that we talk about. We don't want our kids to be going off to college or becoming an adult and then start figuring out how to fail and get themselves back up. So how do we insert that into the preschool things that happen at the Y? So childcare things. If a kid falls down, how do they get back up? How do they self-soothe? Um, Kids in school, how do we help them with learning and coming across things on the playground that are difficult? It's really got to be an all-encompassing thing that we all do together. So the Y alone can't do it. Rady Children's Hospital can't just set up healthcare that's going to solve this. It really has to be us as society coming together and saying, hey, we're going to prioritize youth well-being. And I love the phrase positive youth development, because I think that's what we want for all of our kids, is how do we get them to grow up so that they can become an adult, face the challenges of adulthood, and be a productive member of society.
Yeah, I mean, I have three almost teenage daughters, and when we have conversations around academics or applications for college or like anytime there's a conversation, I am just so aware now that okay, whatever they do is fine. It's more around their mental health. How are they emotionally dealing with this challenge or dealing with this transition? And that's something that
Mhm.
like it's difficult. It's difficult as a parent to actually you want to support them. You want to ensure that they do push themselves to exceed their expectations or meet their expectations, and then finding that balance as in, is this what the individual, is this what they actually want, or am I pushing my agenda? So it is extremely difficult for parents out there, but I think it's really important to be aware that the focus has to be their mental health.
Yeah, I agree completely. It's very difficult to find that balance. One thing that I think is underappreciated and under-discussed, and this is something that Jean Twenge from here in San Diego, San Diego State University, who's done a lot of research on kids and youth mental health. One of the things she points out is sleep has dropped off a lot for kids. So, you mentioned being oversubscribed to sports and academics and all these pressures that kids are having, which clearly is different than it was in the past. If a kid is sleeping less than 8 or 9 hours a night because they have too much homework and too much things on their plate, that's a good indication that the balance is probably off. And I think this is something that schools struggle with. How do you prepare kids for all the college courses and AP credits and all these sorts of things that are now becoming the norm? How do you do that in a way that still prioritizes appropriate amount of sleep, appropriate amount of exercise, or downtime or all these other things. So I think we've hit a point in our society where some of these things need to be rethought.
You've also stated before that mental health isn't just the absence of illness, it's the presence of well-being. What kinds of environments and relationships do kids need to develop this resilience and well-being? What does that ideal environment look like, or what are the key things that should be present?
Yeah, I mean, we've always, throughout humanity, throughout our species' entire history, we've always depended on social connection and social fabric and being a part of a tribe, being a part of a family, having friends, burdening things with each other, not alone. And so I think a key component is community well-being, community connection, social connection, family connection. These things, it sounds cliche, but the research over and over and over again shows that it's one of the most important things we can do, not only for our mental health, but also our physical health, is maintain those good, warm, close, deep connections with the people around us.
When we were looking at the positive youth development framework, one of the, I think it was the Search Institute, named that kids need a web of at least 5 supportive adults, and that web of people that will like support them through that, like challenges, help support their resilience. But again, it was that key focus of a minimum of 5 protective adults. Yeah, no, and it really stuck with me in terms of like, and not even necessarily immediate family, like people in the community, coaches, pastors, if you're in the religious sector, like it's like having that, like, I guess, support mechanism that falls outside of your immediate family.
Exactly.
So again, that's what for us the positive youth development is. We have so many kids coming through our doors that all of our staff have the potential to be one of those key figures. You touched on earlier too the why are setting up this positive youth development framework. What role do you believe we can have, or community organisations such as us, in terms of supporting this mental health in a non-clinical setting?
No. Yeah, I was talking to a friend of mine recently, and he said he has a master's in public health, and in his training, he was taught in order to have a good healthcare system, you need to have a good public healthcare system. It's the idea of prevention. He said, you can't have a good healthcare system if it's being bombarded and burdened by an inordinate amount of people that are ill. And so in the mental health case, I think Rady Children's Hospital, for example, where I work, really important that we need to make sure that kids and families have appropriate care when they need it, how they need it, close to home, accessible, affordable, all those sorts of things. How do we create that continuum of care? But community organizations play a really, really important role in making sure that kids are in situations where they can thrive, that their psychological well-being is being supported before it gets to a point where they might need a clinical intervention. And those two things, I think, really need to be working hand in hand in order to get to the place that I think we all want to be, which is a world where kids are thriving, and when they need services, they get it, and then they get bounced back onto a appropriate developmental trajectory so that they can become the person that ideally that they have the potential to become.
And I think we are now in this climate where we are starting to focus on psychological safety of kids. Before, it's been very much a quality of a program, and are we hitting like our key performance indicators in terms of curriculum and licensing and our environment. But I think the tide is changing, and a lot more services, schools, organizations are really starting to look at the emotional, psychological safety needs of the children, and that really needs to be the priority. How can then our programs like camp or sports programs or after school programs, how can this prevention play a role in the psychological safety of children and young people?
Yeah, it's a great question. I actually just collaborated with a group, a summer camp in Maine, and a data science group where we looked at kids going to a 6-week sleepaway summer camp. And we did a survey and an EEG on the first day that they got there. We looked at their mental health and their social connectedness and empathy through the EEG. And then they did a summer camp experience, 6 weeks of no screens, social connection with friends, outside in nature, eating healthy food. And can you guess what happened after 6 weeks to their mental health? It was a lot better, right?
I was going to say, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's not a surprise. I think we all know this inherently, that if you put a kid in that environment, they very quickly go back to sort of our natural state of psychological well-being. And so I think the role of camps or after school programs or any number of other things that are there to support youth mental well-being and youth development, period. How can you be a part of that? If it's an after school program, 2 hours is also really, really important part of a kid's day, especially a part of their life if it's done on a regular basis. So I think understanding the importance of these things that seem sort of not new, they're really, really pivotal in the upbringing of kids. And I think we need to just highlight the importance of those things more.
I love that you brought that up because there's the Unplugged campaign going around where it's
Mm,
really trying to encourage children and young people to get off screens and
right.
be present. So, what would you say or what do you advocate for in terms of that?
Yeah, the thing that I try to say is we should be telling kids what they sh could be doing instead of what they shouldn't be doing. And the idea of, if a kid wants to play baseball, we should get them in a baseball team. If they want to be a part of a chess club, we should get them in a chess club. The more in-person social connectedness and the more fun kids are having, the better. I think it's a harder message. I'd be curious your take on this with teenage daughters. It's hard to say, hey, get off your phone without an alternative substitute to point them to. Because then they think, well, what am I going to do? Stare at the wall all day? Like they to figure out what could be the positive thing that a kid could learn new skills, gain confidence, gain mastery of a thing, grow their self-esteem, grow their social network, finding things that kids are interested in doing and making those opportunities available for them. I think that's the thing I would advocate for.
Yes, because it is extremely difficult and almost impossible asking them not to be on their phones. Again,
Right.
as adults, we are modeling this a lot. We are on our phones, we are using technology. It has become just part of society and part of life. And I also see that there's a lot of benefits. They are connecting with their friends. They are
Sure.
sitting doing peer study groups on FaceTime with their friends. There's an awful lot of positive stuff that can come from it. I think it can be a lifeline for a lot of children and young people. If they don't have a social network that they can reach out, there's supportive structures there. But I think it is that resilience. It's teaching them like how to use technology safely and
Right.
providing alternatives that it's not their only outlook or their only I guess, social fabric that they have. It's really
Exactly.
a part of their day and a part of their maybe their coping mechanism or a part of their communication. But I agree, the more in-person activities kids can have, the stronger those communication skills, their relationships, and I think happier. They are just
Yeah.
generally happier to be with their friends in person. But there is a place for technology, and I think we have to accept it's part of life, and it's
Yeah.
how we educate and inform them of the safety of it, but yet promoting alternatives as well.
Exactly right. And I think, FaceTime's a good example. It's a great way for families to stay connected with extended family, and it has a lot of benefits. But I don't think any one of us would say we'd rather just Zoom with our family or just FaceTime with our family instead of going on, like actual family reunion where you get together and you're in person with each other. It's hard to like measure that, but I think we all know deep down it's different connecting in person than it is through some virtual medium, even if it's video conferencing.
Yeah, I just think it's really important that when we are present, we try to be 100% present. So whether
Yeah.
that's like dinner time where we're sitting down and all phones and technology is away, or if we're going on a car ride, it's like, okay, we can put music on, we can listen to it together, but can we just put phones down? So I think it's finding those spaces and being intentional about those spaces when we can be present as a
Right.
family, and the same intention when we're in programs and services, actually be intentional of sitting with our kiddos and having conversations with them and not transactional but really connecting with them. It's about being present when we're present.
Yeah, absolutely.
We talk a lot about you don't need to be a therapist to be therapeutical. What would you say for our frontline staff that are working with children and young people? What difference are they making?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is they're making probably the biggest difference in these kids' lives because when you have a kid, say you're playing basketball with a kid or you're out, playing soccer or doing something, the kid's distracted. A lot of times that's the moment that they can be their real self and some of their guards come down. And so many times these are the people that form relationships with kids that are really transformative and inform who they become in their lives. Being a therapist or a psychiatrist or a doctor or a clinician, a lot of times the kid does not want to go and see that person. You're not sometimes doing things that are fun for that child. And so remembering that importance of fun and the ability to create deep relationships through shared experiences that are fun, I just think it's really the fabric of what creates a thriving young person is those types of experiences.
Yeah, I remember my daughter came back from a overnight camp and she came back and you asked her how was camp and you get that yes, it was good and I made friends. And then her face lights up. She talks about her camp counselor, their like the food they enjoyed, the music that they enjoyed. And you can really tell that like her eyes light up, she smiles, she's engaging. She obviously got to know her camp counselor extremely well. She still talks about those experiences almost one summer later. And that just makes my heart full. It's like that was a pure connection activity. The activities were important, but she didn't really communicate that. Most of the communication was around the relationship that she actually had with that camp counselor and the experience and the connection she held. Not so much like the archery or swimming or whatever the program content was. I heard very little about that. What she really talked about was that pure love for that camp counselor and that experience that the counselor had shaped for her during that week. And I think it's really important that staff realize that they are critical and that relationship really is the connection point and the starting point
Hmm.
for all of this work.
Well said. I mean, I think it's really those activities are the mechanism to create all of the positivity that through the social connection and through the shared relationships. You can't get that with sitting around in a blank room looking at the wall with other people, but you can get it if you're doing these fun things together. And I just wonder what our country, what our world would look like if all kids had those sorts of experiences in their lives. What if all kids did sleepaway summer camp and it was affordable and accessible to all? I just think there's so much positive things that come out of it, prepare kids for life and interacting with others and negotiating where they are in the group and all that stuff is, I think, just incredibly important.
Is it's a fantastic experience to be able to offer your child. And it would be amazing if we had some equity and every kid could experience that. As a parent, when you drop your kids off at school or an overnight camp or at a Y program, what do you hope they experience that day?
Yeah, I have a 7-year-old daughter, and when I dropped her off at school this morning and regularly drop her off at Y programs. The thing I'm hoping is that she finds joy in the activity, but also that she learns how to do an activity and that she can build her self-esteem through that process. So if she's learning a new sport, how can she be taught the right technique in order to do that? See that trying and practicing allows her to get better at that thing. And then she starts to understand, hey, I'm actually pretty good at this. That's, I think, a really critical piece of kids' resilience is helping them understand that with effort, with practice, they can get good at something. And failing is part of that typically in the beginning of, trying to do your first cartwheel as a kid. You usually don't get it exactly right. But with a little bit of practice, you get better at that. And I think that sinks in a way that allows them to understand that when they're in college or their first job or any number of things in life that might be challenging, time, effort, practice, thinking about how to do better at it, all those things can work to make you better at those things you set out to do.
We did talk a lot about the challenges. There is many challenges and we know that we have a crisis, but what gives you confidence that things can change, things can be better for this generation or for the next generation? Where is the hope for our kids and for society?
Yeah, I'm ultimately very optimistic at this point for youth mental health in general. I mean, one of the reasons I'm optimistic is we don't have to go figure out what to do. We already sort of know what needs to happen. Most of human history, kids, teenagers, and young people have been one of the most psychologically well demographics. We know how to do that. It requires social connectedness. It requires kids to have access to things. It requires them not to be on their phone all the time in the room by themselves. So we know what the underpinnings are. identity formation, social connectedness, eating good food, sleeping, exercise. A lot of these things are actually free in life, and we know how to get there. And say if you went back 5 years ago, I don't think people were really talking about these things that much. But now, as you pointed out at the beginning of the show, people understand this stuff now. And people realize, hey, the world we're living in isn't exactly conducive sometimes to the things that make us feel good. And we need to push back against that. So I think the pendulum is really ready to swing on the culture and society side of it. So that's one component. I'm optimistic that there's about to be a pendulum swing, and we should all do whatever we can to make that happen sooner rather than later. On the healthcare side of things, we're figuring out better and more innovative ways to provide care to kids when they need it. So Rady Children's Hospital, for example, is embedding master's level therapists into the local pediatric clinics here in our community. And that's getting kids identified sooner and intervened. Intervention can happen sooner and their outcomes are ultimately much better. So I think our approach to the healthcare side of this crisis has improved dramatically. And I think there's hope in that. And then I think bringing it all together, things like sports teams or media or celebrity or others are taking on this issue as well. And so I just envision this incredible future where we all actually come together to solve this problem. And I'd love to be on this podcast 10 years from now when we say, remember when we had that old pesky youth mental health crisis? Aren't we glad we did something about it because kids are really doing well now? So that's my hope. And I honestly think that's achievable.
I definitely, like, I've worked with children and young people in the youth and community sector for a long time, and I definitely think there is some change happening. And I think in terms of how we are supporting our staff and really focusing on this psychological safety, I've seen massive changes in how practitioners are actually dealing with children. And yes, that connection is a priority. However, when stress happens and children are dysregulated or there is behavioral challenges, staff get stressed and they get pulled away from that lens. How or what advice would you give for staff dealing with children when there's a lot more anxiety or dysregulation or behavioral incidents? Do you have any advice in terms of how they can support that connection, or where they're rather than that traditional lens? Sometimes we come down to that traditional lens of like authority, accountability, and consequences. What advice do you have for staff that are trying to navigate and support children's emotional well-being through behavioral incidents?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think what one concept of that always it always helps me in these situations is just the idea of finding deeper patience within myself and the opportunity for personal growth when you're in a tough situation with a client or kid or somebody that's in your program. So finding ways that you can support your own psychological well-being and resilience. For some people, that's meditation or breath work or yoga or getting outside or exercise or making sure you have good sleep or good social connection in your own life so that when you show up, you're ready to go and you're ready to take on shouldering the burden of a young child that's still trying to figure things out. The other idea that I've seen work quite well in the work I do with kids is helping them find their identity. So saying something like, I've noticed that you're a very patient kid. I work with a lot of kids, and you're one of the most patient kids I've seen in a long time. It may or may not be totally true, but if a kid is told by some person of authority that they have this positive characteristic, many times they incorporate that into their identity and it changes the way they behave. So we can all do that with the kids we're working on, help them bring into their identity positive attributes like patience, kindness, friendship, forgiveness, resilience. I think that's something we should all be trying to do as well.
I love that. And that's one of the strategies that we are really trying to focus on is being strength based. Yes, there may be an issue with how they're engaging with their friends or their language, but rather than calling out some of the things that we see as issues, let's call out the strength based. Like you developed a really nice friendship or you played really well with that group of peers today, like really naming their positive strengths as opposed to looking at the deficits.
Yeah.
We talked a lot. If you have one message for parents or youth workers or educators to promote mental health and build protective factors, what would it be? What's your final message?
Yeah, I mean, I think childhood and adolescence is all about identity formation as you enter into adulthood. And identity formation depends on social connections and shared experiences. And so I think framing childhood as this important period of life that prepares us for adulthood is the message I would put out there.
Dr. Maxwell, thank you so much for this conversation and for you and all of your colleagues for doing what you do every single day and really supporting our children and young people that are in crisis and our community. Where can our listeners go if they are looking for any more helpful information in relation to mental health or resources for themselves or their children?
Yeah, Rady Children's Hospital has many clinics throughout the county. Pediatricians are a great example of a place that you can get physical and mental health care support. So that exists throughout our community. We do also operate a behavioral health urgent care down in Mid-City. And so that's a place that if people are in immediate psychiatric need, there's an urgent care there. You can walk in or schedule an appointment, usually pretty quickly. And if, we should always say, like, if things are in a place where it's dangerousness or really emergent, calling 911 or going to the closest emergency room is something that is always there. It's the ultimate safety net that's there for all people here in our.
Thank you so much. It's really important for us as the Y that we have these conversations, keep advocating and develop an awareness of this issue and how we can actually hopefully swing that pendulum and have some change. Thank you so much for your time, and we'll see you in 10 years.
Thank you, Jacqui. This has been a lot of fun.
Bye bye.